thank you. Thank you also for thinking of us. I'm glad that we had that moment where you already attended one of the talks from the foundation at Rodkapia. The topic at that time was more on how different archiving practices can depart from or stay close to what we think of as a traditional archive. And today, I'll still talk about some of that a bit closer to the end, but I'll focus more on this idea of what does it mean to be an information worker in times of crisis? What does it require from us? How does existing in this time expose the limitations of our normal course of work? Which is why the title of this is When Remembering is Not Enough. And I'll explain a little bit about how that idea came to be. But just to give us a sense of how the flow will be for the talk, I'm really glad that we already had a workshop. So some of the concepts that we talked about will be, I guess, deepened here because you'll understand more of the framework that they come from. But I was really interested in that idea of crisis and the idea of what does it mean to try to develop these practices of collective survival in the field of information work, which is part of a broader kind of cultural sphere, right? So I wanted to think about first what the character of the current threat is and how does it have anything to do with information or archives in particular, because that's the question I was asking myself. And then how do we move from remembering to resisting? How do we move our archives from just sources of documentation into resources for action? And how, as archivists or information workers ourselves, we're sort of called on to do more in these times. And then a little bit of a case study on our work with the foundation and how we put those principles into practice. And then maybe some calls to action from our end, but you might also think of things that this presentation maybe hopes that you carry with you or take with you for future things. I did promise I was going to talk about myself more, but not so much more. But yeah, my name is Lilah. I am the archivist for the Jose Maria Sison Legacy Foundation, which is an organization that preserves and shares the writings primarily of Jose Maria Sison, who was a Filipino revolutionary who was a political exile in the Netherlands for the last decades of his life. He passed away in 2022, but he is very big figure in terms of the resurgence of the Filipino people's movement for national liberation, and also became quite a fixture in progressive spaces in the Netherlands as well. So there is a good connection that we have here to this particular place. But the work of the foundation actually started from an archives project. Once Jose Maria Sison passed away in 2022, I was already here doing sort of community archiving work, and there was this immediate need that came up to archive his papers because he had such a long life and he was in so many different organizations. And those organizations are really significant to the Filipino people. So it became important to sort of try to get a sense of what was there and what could be made useful for current and future generations of activists. And more on this later when we talk about the foundation. But first, I want to talk about what came to mind around this topic of collective survival, of archiving, and what kind of threat we were responding to. When we first talked about this, Hu Ying and Carrie and I, we were talking about, okay, there are things in times of crisis where we feel this urgency to keep certain information. We feel an urgency to protect, what we're making in our organizations, in our movements, because we see and we know that there is a very real threat to its existence. And that actually that thought became really crystallized to me in the few weeks since we had that talk to now. Because, and I'm not sure how many of you know this, but one of the first Asian president, basically the first Asian head of state, who was taken to the International Criminal Court was, or is, Rodrigo Duterte. Does anyone know about this case at the ICC? Right, so Rodrigo Duterte was the president before the one that we have right now, and more on him later as well. But while he was in power, instituted this policy called, well, it was known as a war on drugs. But actually it was a war on the poor, primarily. It resulted in the deaths of around 30,000 people. And these people were mostly, poor young men from urban poor communities. They were killed either by, sort of like these mercenary figures, or killed as part of police raids. And the narrative around Duterte's rise to power, how he justified his acts, and how also his followers and his supporters continue to use these narratives to discredit the victims, to discredit the survivors, is a concrete example of the way that the struggle is happening ideologically in the field of information. And this is one of the threats that we should acknowledge and contend with if we are doing work. One of the things that came out, for example, from his rise to the presidency is that it was actually largely manipulated by big kind of like data institutions or like companies like Cambridge Analytica. They formed his campaign to present him as a certain kind of candidate that actually led to him winning the presidency. And the tactics that were used in that process are now being used for subsequent presidents and also all over the world. This is why the Philippines has become known as like patient zero for disinformation, because he really won on that kind of campaign. Disinformation and the use of trolls or the use of different kinds of actors online to manipulate the political space. And so this is something that happened in the Philippines, but I'm sure we can see parallels or other examples of how this kind of thing is happening all over the world. So this is one very clear example of how this field of information is one that is fraught. There is like a fight, there's a battle going on here. And so if we're to engage as information workers, we need to be aware of that and then sort of choose the side that we're going to be on in that struggle. It's also very interesting because just like very many kinds of different tactics of surveillance, control, violence, deception, these are often tested in places like the Philippines and then brought to the imperial core. When you think of different military tactics, tactics for waging counterinsurgency, even tactics for policing, a lot of those things were tested out on people from colonized countries. And then this stuff is then brought back to the imperial core. I mean, which is also not to say that there's a lot of things that have been invented in terms of colonial genocide in the imperial core, but this is a common example of how things work. And in information, it's no different from any other tactic of violence. So while Duterte was in office, as I mentioned, this so-called war on drugs that killed, tens of thousands of people, it was also used as a cover for sort of more politically motivated killings of activists and dissenters. And the killings that are the subject of the ICC case are very limited scope, right? And they're only talking about murder or attempted murder. But actually, his regime was rampant in terms of other kinds of crimes against humanity. So things like illegal arrest and detention, kidnapping, rape, torture, harassment, also rampant corruption and plunder, and a host of crimes against the Filipino people that he's not actually facing charges for. And this has this should show us also that when we talk about battles in the field of information, we're also talking about real life battles for life and death. That those things are actually like mutually reinforcing, right? It's often tactics of overt violence, but then also tactics of deception. And so they build upon each other. So we're not just talking about how people are victimized online, harassed or trolled, but how that also props up this kind of culture of impunity that travels to real life and that actually has real life consequences. And some of those consequences are this like chilling of the space for freedom of expression, for freedom of dissent, freedom of assembly, freedom of organization, basically attacks against democratic rights, people's rights as a whole. So you see during his presidency, there were also things like different types of laws, like cyber libel or different kinds of things that were being used against critics and dissenters of his regime. Some very well known, like Maria Ressa is a very well known journalist. She was actually charged with cyber libel for her criticisms under the media outlet Rappler. There were also different laws that were signed into place that really were meant to attack people's ability to raise any sort of critique against the government. And so you're seeing this like narrowing of the space to have ideological debate. So there's that form of threat that's happening as well. And it's not just limited to journalism. It also feeds into all of the different aspects of what we can talk about as the superstructure. Basically, this like the realm of society and culture, right? So things like schools. In the Philippines, there have been very well-known cases of, for example, indigenous schools in Mindanao being bombed because they were accused of spreading like subversive education to the students, which was actually, just encouraging the teaching of their indigenous language and indigenous culture and defending their land, which is what they were doing. You also have university libraries where certain books were starting to be taken out of the library. So there's like purging and censorship of different kinds of things. This other aspect, so not just like these kind of offensive tactics, but also very preemptive tactics. Things like taking out Philippine history from the educational curriculum. So in 2014, this was actually even before Duterte's time, they took out Philippine history from high school education, which means that the only time Filipino students learn about Philippine history, like in their course, like mandated in their courses, are in elementary school. Or if they make it to college and they choose to do that, potentially there. But this whole swath of time where they're not learning the history of the Filipino people. And the Philippine people's history is actually quite progressive, quite revolutionary, right? We were people who were colonized for over 300 years by Spain. We had a revolution against Spanish colonization that would have been successful, except for the fact that basically Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. And so if you don't know that revolutionary history, if you don't know this history that you should take pride in, if it's being suppressed, then it really limits your ability to see your potential as a people and to fight back. And this doesn't just happen here, right? One thing that I've always been curious about since I moved to the Netherlands is like, what's the progressive history of the Netherlands? I mean, there is one. There's one everywhere, right? But I have I have like very little small ideas of it. And you have to look for it. But the fact is that it has been there, fighting fascism during World War II, all of these different things. It exists. But if you're not aware of it, then it, for one thing, you lose this historical connection and lessons that could be built upon in the current day. And then for another thing, it it really makes you feel like you have to start from the beginning if you want to start anything, which is untrue, right? You have a historical legacy that you could draw on that would be potentially useful. But if you're deprived of it, then it limits your ability to resist in the current day and age. So those are some things that we need to, like some dots we should like connect in terms of how attacks on information and attacks on history, attacks on knowledge are also attacks on the self and the ability to stand up for that self. And lest people think that this is all about Duterte and that it stopped after Duterte, it didn't, because the current president who is in office is actually the son of one of our country's most infamous dictators. On February 25th of this year, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of what's called the People Power Uprising. It was like this huge, massive upsurge of popular like resistance against the Marcos Sr. regime that ousted him from office. And less than 40 years later, and we're doing this, we're having this commemoration, his son is the president. So in the span of only a few decades, you have this collective forgetting from society of like what happened during that time. You have people who are still very much alive and not very old, who are survivors of torture, who are survivors of rape, of kidnapping, of all of these things, who are still alive. And yet, his son rose to power. And we have to see that also as part of the battle for information. Because it's only through huge amounts of money being poured into concerted efforts at whitewashing this brutal legacy that this was able to take place, in addition to things like not knowing Philippine history. If you don't know what happened like less than 40 years ago, why would you associate that with this person who's running for office? And he's also learning from the playbook of the successes of Duterte in terms of using media, using information, using trolls, manipulating the digital environment to like rebrand his family and to gain political office again. So this is like how we know that we are living in a very like heightened and escalating time in terms of like threats to information. So let me see if I can, why harp on this so much? This is a saying that's like attributed to one of the Philippines' national heroes. He was a writer named Jose Rizal. And his own books, actually, Jose Rizal's books during Spanish colonial period were banned because they were critical of Spanish colonization. Paraphrased, it says, "To know history is to know self." But conversely, if your history is being taken away from you, then so is your sense of self. And so is your ability to fight back, your ability to like see a different future for yourself and for your people. And so that's the kind of, I guess, the short version of why it should be important to information workers, to cultural workers who are dealing with the past that is very much present, that we're all still like living and contending with. And so how do we take archives then from this realm of history, from the past, and understand that it very much has to deal with how we can understand our capabilities and possibilities in the present day and build a possible future. During the Duterte protests that were happening, there was an activist from a human rights organization in the Philippines. Her name is Tinay Palabay. She's from Karapatan. You can look it up. It's a very good source for information on what's happening in the Philippines. But she kept on saying this phrase, which is like, remembering is nothing without action. And she would like keep on repeating it. And I was like, that is actually, as an archivist, I was like, that's I was like, why have I never thought about like this before? You know, like we've thought about things like, okay, we should preserve the past to build the future, all of this stuff. But like the very like simple saying of like, actually, it's not enough. It's not enough to remember. You actually have to do something about it. You have to like keep that history alive and live it out in some way. It also reminded me of this this filmmaker from the Philippines. His name was Lino Broca. He made a lot of really great social realist films. If you're interested in like understanding what Philippine society looks like, it's still very much the same as when he was making movies, like in the 80s. But he started this organization for cultural workers called Concerned Artists of the Philippines. And the reason why he started it was because he was like, you know, I kept on making films. I kept on making films about the conditions. I kept on making films about like what poverty looked like in the Philippines. And I realized that like that wasn't enough. Like I needed to actually become an activist. I needed to fight for the rights of filmmakers. I needed to fight for the rights of the poor, for the workers, for the peasants in the Philippines who are the most oppressed. It's not enough for me to just show what life is like, but I need to be part of it. And that was his, you know, one of the motivations for starting that organization. And it's also the idea that we have with us in our work, which is that, and this is a repeat from the workshop before, but like the best way to keep knowledge alive isn't to like fix it in place, to document it, to record it in some way, but it's to keep the sources of that knowledge alive. So to keep the people, to keep the land, to keep the places, to keep the culture, to keep the communities, to keep that alive is the best way to ensure the continuity of that knowledge and of that information. You know, when you record something, it keeps it safe, it keeps it in a form that can be shared, and that is very useful things. Like, I don't want to say that they're not useful, but, you know, those crystallizations are only as good as they can be used by the people who are actually carrying out that living history itself. So that's why we think of our work as like being part of like these like living archives. And these have a lot of different examples in many different parts of the world. These are some examples. This is like a Filipino example. Actually, it's quite timely because in April, there's always this big, basically gathering in the north of the Philippines, in the mountains, where like the Cordillera indigenous peoples are. And it's around Cordillera Day, which is a day where one of the chiefs of the communities that like lie along the river of the Cordilleras, he was martyred because he was resisting the development of a dam that would basically wipe out the entire, like all of the communities along that river. Actually, it was a dam that was going to be put in place by Marcos Sr. So, yeah. And so every year, people would come together to talk about what he did, but also to bring together all of these youth from the Cordillera. And what they would do is they would have educational discussions on like, okay, what are the current mining companies that are here in our communities? What are the current dam projects that they're trying to push through? How can we fight against them? How do we use our culture, our stories, all of these things to express how our history of struggle, but not only that, to keep it carrying forward. And this is a quote from like one of the people from the Cordillera People's Alliance, which is an organization there. And I didn't even have to, like, when I interviewed him, this was part of my archives thesis. Like, he just gave me this, like, piece of gold that he just said, and I didn't even have to say anything. But he was like, oh, yeah, archives, of course, we know what that is. Like, Cordillera Day is actually an archive. It is a living archive of our struggle. And that is like an example, right, of how we want to keep these things alive in a way that carries on the original spirit of which they were created, right? Like these stories, these songs, these chants and everything, they were generated out of a very specific political need. And so that political need needs to be understood and carried forward, or else it's just like you lack the context for why these things exist in the first place. More than just a gathering, Cordillera Day is a political statement on present realities by the militant Cordillera People's Movement. It carries with it the historical advances of the mass movement for self-determination and national democracy. There's actually a quote from the same person. It's not that person. But so this is in effect what we should try to do as information workers, is like be part of the struggle, understand the context behind the records that we're stewarding, and try to keep that context alive. And so with that, I'll move on to how the Jose Maria Sison Foundation actually does this. Because that's the same framework that we use when we approach our work. So as I said, that is what we do as a foundation. We share and preserve JMS's legacy. And it does it through 4 different components. So we have the archives, we have a museum, we have events, and we also have the website. And I'll show you a little bit of that if we have time. But to get a little bit of a sense of who Jose Maria Sison was, and also the movement that arose, that he had a great big contribution to, this is a little bit about his life. So he was born in 1939. When he was a student activist, he became involved in starting lots of different youth organizations that were intended to address like the major problems in the Philippines. So the major problems in the Philippines, the 2 biggest problems are like 1, the problem of land. The Philippines is coming from a history of very feudal and then semi-feudal modes of production. So the majority of the people in the Philippines live in rural areas. They till the land, but they don't own it, because who owns it are these very big landlord families that are actually the ancestors of the native populations who became quite close with the Spanish colonizers. So they would be gifted these tracts of land from like the clergy or the religious orders or things like that. I mean, the church is still a major landlord in the Philippines also. So there's the problem of land. Then there's also the problem of basically foreign intervention and control. Like the Philippines is nominally independent, but in every aspect of its governance, economically, militarily, culturally, politically, all of these things, it's actually very influenced by the US. There's almost nothing that can be done in the Philippines that is not directed by the US. To give you an example, in 2013, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a trans woman named Jennifer Laude, who was killed by a US Marine. Even though they tried to try him in Filipino courts, basically the US military came and surrounded him, took him to their own facility, and basically protected him from the charges laid by the Philippine state. Imagine this, if a foreign national came to your country, committed a crime, killed someone, and then they were tried actually in court and sentenced and charged, and they did not live out that sentence because another government said no. Like, how much sovereignty do you think that country has? Very little. So that's an example of how the Philippines really is not free. And so there is still an ongoing struggle for national and social liberation in the country. And so it becomes important, if we are dealing with the records of this individual and also the records of the movement, because that's part of the many organizations that he was part of, that we have to also start from the same kind of ideological foundations and understandings, or else we won't be able to really understand his records. We don't understand like why they came to be, the processes that made them. So then it's important for us to understand that, and to also take the same sort of side. I will go through some sides, but this is an example of how there are sides within any sort of information struggle. It's a very big quote, but it's from an archivist that was working in South Africa. This was around the truth and reconciliation process that they had there around apartheid. And he was very key because during that process, a lot of the records were being destroyed. Like a lot of the records of the apartheid were being taken out, shredded, because the history of it, which actually was, it was official bureaucratic history, but it documented atrocity, were trying to be hidden. And so he was involved in this process of trying to make sure that they were kept. Memory is never a faithful reflection of process of reality. It is shaped, reshaped, figured, configured by the dance of imagination. So that beyond the dynamics of remembering and forgetting, a more profound characterization of the struggle in social memory is one of narrative against narrative, story against story. So in a sense, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to assert our narrative, our story, and what is our truth in the face of these kinds of dominant processes that try to erase it or take it away from us. And we understand that we understand where these things come from too. So this is our sort of starting point as a foundation, is that we understand that the way that we keep information, the way that archives traditionally do things, is a reflection of the very material economic base of our society. So in the Philippines, because we are very feudal still in very many ways, and because we're still a neo-colony of the United States, everything in our culture, in our practices of keeping information, the archives, things like that, are a reflection of that inequality, a reflection of that injustice. It's the same, anywhere. Here we have a lot of criticisms of, traditional archives, marginalizing voices, the erasure of different points of view, how they are very colonial in nature. It's not a mistake that they're like that. They're a reflection of the society that made them. Of course they're like that. So, it helps us to understand, okay, this is why they exist in this way. It doesn't mean, though, that it has to always be this way. Just because these things typically reflect what our society is founded on, it doesn't mean that we can not change them. And then in trying to change them, also try to then affect that foundation. So we do have a role. We can push society, and we can push these aspects of society that we have influence on, art or culture archives, to then affect the very economic base of our society. In other words, that means that this ideological struggle that we're going through has very definite sides. The side that is intent on maintaining the power structure the way it is, and then the side that wants to transform it. So then we get to decide which side of that coin we're going to be on. And that's why we take a very specific bias in terms of our work in the foundation. So this is why we asked ourselves very real questions that we asked in our workshop. For whom are we doing it? It is not for everyone. It's not even for every Filipino, right? It is for the struggling Filipino people who are intent on making change in their society. And it's their perspective that we give priority to. It's their perspective, it's their personality that we talk to. Of course, we're not the only people who do this. For example, this is the Philippine Labor Movement Archive. They are also a volunteer-run organization in the Philippines that works very closely with the trade union movement to archive the labor struggle in the Philippines. And this is like a very long-standing struggle that's also very much under threat. Rights of workers in the Philippines, just like here, are being very curtailed. You know, the ability to strike is like very difficult, you know, all of these different kinds of things. So they take primarily photographs of these different labor struggles over time, and they bring together anyone, like members of the public, the community, who want to learn how to digitize them and also identify who's in these photographs. And by doing so, they make people aware of really the long history of working class struggles in the Philippines, and that these things are actually lessons that we can learn and inspiration that we can carry with us. And that in very many ways is similar to how we do things at the Jose Maria Sison Legacy Foundation. So this is an example. It's a still from our opening from the museum. I will focus, I guess, on the museum because it's kind of it brings together kind of all aspects of what we do. So we have, again, like the website, the archives, museum, and events. The museum is one way that we can really do all of those things. For one thing, it was really built on the archival work that we had done for the 2 years previous to its opening. So a lot of the things in the museum are these, actually they're the originals. We did reproduce the photographs because they're quite, you know, delicate. But in terms of the other documents, we put them in sort of like protective housing, but we want people to touch them. We want people to engage with them, because we also see history as not something that should be just sort of like viewed behind glass, but like something that people should engage with, because it's still happening and they can see themselves in it and also reflect from it. We also use it for events a lot of the time, because, I mean, and one of the most common things is doing these kinds of like tours to the museum. We talked in the workshop about how one of the important aspects of mobilizing archives, sorry, and making them useful is by knowing how they can sort of elicit emotion, agitate people, and make them care. One of the things we didn't really anticipate, although maybe we should have, when we opened the museum was how emotional people would get when we walked through it. Like, I didn't realize that people, like, there would be so many people who would like cry. And I was also crying, and I was like, I know, like, I know this information, like, why am I all of a sudden like so affected by it? But yeah, like people would, there's another picture actually of like some people at our opening just like embracing each other, like holding each other, because they were so moved, not by like the, you know, this like singular like individual life, but by just like the scope of what they had begun to understand about what it means to be a revolutionary through good and bad and ups and downs and challenges and all these things, and how one of the most revolutionary things that you can be is like an optimist, is to like have hope and imagination, because without it, you know, you'll never, if you don't believe that you can do it, it's not going to happen. If you don't believe that you can build a different society, it's never going to happen. If you can't imagine what that might look like, it's not going to happen. So like the things that you need to have, like I think that was how we realized like the importance of this space for not only educating people, but also like propagandizing to them, like serving as counter propaganda for all of the other kinds of propaganda that we get that just really are about maintaining the status quo. And so, yeah, I guess we're like 3 minutes out from 4, so I don't want to, you know, make us go overtime or anything like that. But this is like, I guess, one aspect that I guess we can all take with us today, is that hope, you know, that things do seem bad. I mean, if we look at the world, we're like, ooh, it's bad. But, you know, things have also been bad before. Like, this is the thing about, like, crisis or apocalypse or whatever is that in a way it always existed because these inequalities were built into this system. It's just that certain communities face it and have faced it before, like for a long time before. So for one thing, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from that. There's a lot of struggles that have been happening for very many decades that we can learn from. And it means that, you know, we don't have to see this as the end of history, right? And that's why I guess we'll go back to the apocalypse like terminology, is that, you know, sometimes it's not bad for worlds to end if those worlds were unjust and involved our enslavement and our oppression and our exploitation. It's okay if those worlds end. So then part of our work as information people is to help build the idea of the new world and to take part in it as well. That there is a society that's more just and more equitable that's possible, and we need to take part in it. And that's it. Yeah.